What's going on, everybody? Gareth here, FCP Euro. Welcome back to another DIY video. Today, we're going to be replacing the valve covers on a 2011 BMW M3 with NRW Design valve covers. Why would you need to replace the valve covers on an E9X M3? That would be a 2008-2013 M3, E90, E92, E93. And the simple answer is the original factory valve covers are magnesium. They outgas, the coating peels off of them. That coating also could fall off inside the engine, potentially clogging up your oil pickup for the oil pump. Also, there's been other structural issues with these valve covers long run. The factory valve covers are very expensive. They're almost $1,100 a piece. These cast aluminum versions from NRW Design mimic the factory design one-to-one, but they do have some color options. So in this case, we'll be installing wrinkle black. They do have OEM gray, smooth black, red, yellow, blue, or custom order options. And with that said, a couple other things we'll be doing as well. We'll be installing the NRW Design silicone intake plenum couplers along with their silicone grommet kit, which, if you know anything about these engines, you can't just replace the valve cover grommet from BMW. You'd have to buy the entire screw. They're about $10 a piece, 26 screws, that's $260. That's silly, when the only reason you ever have to replace is because this grommet has deteriorated. The silicone won't. Same thing with the couplers. So while we have the valve covers off, we're going to be replacing this hardware as well. This is what we're installing. Now that we've addressed that, let's talk about some of the tools we're going to need to do this job, and we'll go ahead and jump right into it. So shockingly, you really don't need that many tools to do a valve cover on these engines. It's mostly standard sizes, so 13 millimeter, 10 millimeter sockets. You'll want a mid-length, ideally, and a shallow T20 and T25 torque socket. You'll want different size ratchets. To be honest with you, I really like this style ratchet, a really stubby 1/4 inch for torquing and tightening down the valve cover screws. You'll want a 6 millimeter and 7 millimeter hose clamp driver for dealing with a lot of the intake plenum stuff. Extensions, various sizes. One of these pocket screwdrivers with a little magnetic tip is going to be super helpful. Same thing, one of these little pry bars for dealing with a lot of the connectors. And that's really it. It's just a lot of hands-on disconnecting things, moving stuff out of the way, but really don't need that many tools to do it. You're just going to be using your hands quite a bit for this job, so that's what you need. And now that we've talked about the tools, let's jump into it. So I'm going to start off by doing what we need to do to get the air box out of the way. And I'm going to start right up here with the suction hood. 2 T20 screws. Secure this to the radiator support. So I'm going to remove these. And then we have these little expanding rivets. Just using these pliers to pull the center section up. This whole forward section will slide forward. And then we have the rearward section, which will simply pull back and slide off like so. And now we have 8 T25 screws that secure the airbox cover to the bottom of the airbox. All right, so at this point, this has a E-venturi cold air intake on it. Most of this procedure has been the same up to this point. The only place where this could be different is these hose clamps here. It's a 7 millimeter drive for the E-venturi setup. It might be 6 for the factory clamp. I don't really remember off the top of my head. But either way, we're going to loosen this clamp. And then on your factory airbox, the filter is supported by a spring-loaded mechanism here. So you'd have to pull that plunger forward and then pull the entire piece out in one section. You know, obviously, if you have a different intake on your car, that's going to be different. And now to remove the rest of the airbox, we have 2 10 millimeter screws that secure it to the body. So I'm going to start with the left cylinder bank. This is bank 2, so cylinders 5 through 8. We'll do each side independently because they have their own sort of constraints. You'll notice that the engine cover, or this ignition coil cover on this side, our fuel feed line is connected to it, so we're going to have to pull this up and out of it, like so. We also have our secondary air pump fresh air hose that runs in the back, so that kind of hinders us a little bit. These are just held in place by some grommets. So you're going to pull up evenly, like so. And then you have to snake it forward, like so. And these are the grommets that secure the valve cover, or this little ignition coil cover, to the valve cover. So it secures here and back there. All right, so next up, we're going to disconnect our ignition coils. Simply push down on the little release here, and they should slide off fairly easily. If they're not, you could use a little pry bar to slide them back. However, I can't say, at least on these engines, I've ever had an issue with these connectors coming off. So these ignition coils do not come out very easily on this engine. BMW has a special puller tool just for these, and you don't need it, but these ignition coils are very expensive. You do not want to break one. So this is where I said, you know, the puller is not necessary. Now I wish I had the $280 special tool from BMW because it would save some time. But what I'm going to do is flathead screwdriver right through here. And as I'm pulling up on this, I'm also going to pull from the coil itself. There we go. Just as like a little extra, needs a little extra encouragement. But yeah, these things are super, super tight on the spark plug. It's not really here where you have the problem, it's down there. So just finding a place to safely pry from, you just need to get these things moving. You do risk breaking that off or tweaking it sideways, so you really want to be careful. So for our right bank, or bank 1, cylinders 1 through 4, we need to pull our expansion tank forward, and we have two 10mm screws that secure the tank in location. There's a couple of grommets that secure the tank in place, but you can basically pull this whole thing forward. Just be really careful with this line underneath and the return line here. You can get quite a bit of angle on these things and really work it forward so that it is completely out of the way. So we do have a level sensor here. We want to disconnect it. And if you have a good expansion tank and good connections, it won't leak coolant all over the place. So now we need to remove the ignition coil cover here. Same thing as the other side, just held in with a couple of grommets. So pull up and slide this forward. Again, you would not be able to do that if you left the expansion tank in the way, plus it frees up a lot of space. Similar process here. I'm going to use any pry point available and get the coils moving. Once they're moving, they fairly come out, you know, reasonably easy, but not really. You just got to break that initial seal. So at this point, with the expansion tank pulled forward, which we're going to have to do anyway, we are going to disconnect the air temperature sensor here from the front of the intake manifold, and now we have 9 connections. Actually, I'm sorry, 10. There's another sensor, another vacuum line rather, directly underneath the intake plenum here in the front, and then we have 8 plenum couplers, which are secured with a 6mm clamp, and then there is a breather vent or a vent in the back of the plenum, which you can only get access to once you've loosened up the plenum from the couplers. So from this point, we should be able to lift the plenum up off the couplers like so. Remember, we have this line here towards the front, which actually just kind of came off, so that's convenient. And now we have this additional connection here in the rear, which you can't really see. I'll show you once the plenum's off. You kind of have to go in with your fingers. It's this style clamp that you're going to have to press, while also wiggling the manifold off. You heard it just release. Kind of inconvenient. That rear one has been known to catch people off from time to time. And then just pull the plenum out, like so. And this is the hose I was talking about in the rear. So you have to reach in and depress those tabs to get it to release. And then this was the additional line up here that you have to disconnect. In my case, it disconnected itself somehow. That's a little unusual, but that's fine. So our next step here, depending on your approach here, we took out the coils first because we're doing some other work before we got into this video. This is where you'd pull the coils out, but we do need to disconnect our cam sensors. We're gonna have to disconnect our fuel injectors and all of the other wiring harness stuff that is attached here. We got a couple of grounds. So I'm gonna start here at our cam position sensors up front. So looking down our side here, we'll just pull our wiring harness out of these little holders. And if you look right here, we have this mounting point for the ignition coil cover. That is also a grounding point for our harness, so I'm gonna have to remove that nut. So it is a 13 millimeter, you're gonna need to use a deep socket. These are not very tight. It's just a ground. We're gonna look here at the back. Just generally need to make sure that we get this wiring harness dislodged from the coil, from the cover, which it now is. These locks for these connectors from BMW are awful. You have to basically pull it off to the side, and these clips are also known to sometimes disappear in the engine bay. So basically just pull it down off to the side like that. You have to do it on both sides. Fortunately, there's pretty decent access here once the plenum is off. But it's still kind of a fiddly design. And you know, these connectors, I'm pretty sure originate back into the early 90s. I've worked on E36s that have the same style setup for their fuel injector connectors. These come off very easily. And what I do is I make sure that I reseat these locks, because you can reconnect these connectors with the locks in place, and then you don't have to worry about one of them falling off and disappearing. And I would say that's probably important on this application because, as you can see, this harness is very loose. It's not a rigid piece, so I would not rely on the harness itself to keep the connector plugged in. We do have a 10 millimeter nut right here, which secures our harness ground to the valve cover, so I'm gonna loosen that up now. At this point, before I move to the other side, I'm gonna remove our bank 2 valve cover now. All of these valve cover nuts are screws really, are 10 millimeter. So we're just gonna go around the perimeter and loosen them all. Fortunately on this engine, there's no internal, like none on the inside, so they're all perimeter, which makes it a little bit easier. Now that all of our valve cover screws are loose, including that one in the back, just gonna rock it like so. And there we go, valve cover's out. Order of operation is gonna be the same here on bank 1, which is the right side. Only thing we don't really have to deal with is our evap line and the secondary air pump, fresh air supply hose, and a bunch of other stuff. So this side will be a little bit more straightforward to deal with, but still gonna have the same problems with these connectors that have never been touched. They can be stubborn, so just take your time. All right, so we got the valve covers off. I'm gonna transfer some stuff over. The camshaft sensors, there's no reason to replace them. They're perfectly fine. The breather box, again, totally fine. No reason to replace it. So I'm gonna start with these. It's T30. The crankcase breather, they're sealed with O-rings, so we do have new O-rings. I have already built up one valve cover, which you would have seen at the introduction with all the stuff on it, so you can kind of see how it shows up versus what it'll look like by the time you install it. So we have a seal right here inside the breather. You need to pull out. This kind of sits recessed to it because it's compressed. You could, of course, put new breathers on if you wanted to, but again, these are not particularly failure prone, and this is a pretty low mileage car, so just reusing them. But definitely important to use new seals. The square cut seal, which is a larger one, that goes into this ventilation port here. And then we have this round O-ring, which physically sits inside the valve cover once it's pressed into place. We'll slip that on like so. And then we'll come to the NRW valve cover. Press it into place. We'll take the original T30 screws. And, you know, again, thing to note, these NRW Design valve covers are literally a one-to-one replica. So all the holes are located where they need to be. All the factory equipment works the way that it's supposed to. There's really any kind of funny business you're going to have to do to get these to install. Next up, we're going to take the cam sensors. These are not side specific. Again, same sensors used in all 4 locations, so you don't need to keep track of anything like that. And these were working perfectly fine. So we're not going to replace them. We're going to install the new O-rings. Highly recommend that you do that. And then you will push the new cam sensors into place. Or I'm sorry, not new, but ones that you transferred. You could, of course, put some new ones on if you really wanted to, but I think that's going to depend on how you're feeling about your car and the mileage it's at. If it's higher mileage, maybe you'd want to replace these items, but for this car, it did not make sense to do that. And then you have these ball studs right here that secure the ignition coil cover. Don't install them towards the rear. Only put the ones on the front because the rear is used as a grounding point. And that is all we're going to take from the original valve cover. Like I mentioned, we do have these NRW valve cover grommets. We're going to be installing those because those are silicone and will pretty much last the life of the vehicle, or pretty much close to it. Definitely going to last a lot longer than the factory rubber ones would. We have a brand new valve cover gasket. These are side specific, so you can only install them one way. Now we're going to install the valve cover grommets from NRW onto the valve cover screws. So what we're going to do is simply press these into the gasket, and that kind of like locks onto the gasket and keeps it in place. And when it comes to these grommets, there's a little lip at the bottom that's going to point down. The flat part points towards this washer, or the sleeve washer at the top. And the last thing that we need to do is pre-install the spark plug tube seals. Could you reuse these? Yes. Should you? Ideally, no. The last thing you really want is oil leaking into your spark plug wells. This is the spark plug well. So, you know, if the seal down here is compromised, or, you know, up here is compromised, you have a bunch of oil leaking into your spark plug recess. And remember, this car has about $2,400 worth of ignition coils on it. So just replace these. Not gonna play that game. All right. That is all she wrote. I'm gonna take a little bit of RTV and coat the edges here. It's generally good practice anytime you have 2 mating surfaces to use RTV, because there could be some irregularities between those surfaces. Okay, we're taking our valve cover assembly and we're gonna go ahead and drop it into position. Obviously we wanna make sure that we get it seated into position first before we try to push it down. The spark plug tubes will sort of line up, and then once they're lined up, push the entire assembly down. Also want to make sure that the wiring harness at the back doesn't get pinched, because the last thing you want is your wiring harness inside the freaking engine. So we got bank 1 valve cover installed. Torque spec is 10 Newton meters for the screws. You can only really get to a handful of them with the torque wrench. The further back in the engine bay you go, the less room you're gonna have. So my recommendation is tighten everything down evenly, start from the middle, work your way out in a rotating pattern, then go around the perimeter one more time. I'm using this really short 1/4 inch ratchet, 10 millimeter. Basically, I have my thumb and my finger here, and I'm feeling for it to bite down and get tight. Once the screws are evenly tightened, which you'll be able to feel, you don't really have to go further than that. All you're trying to do is make sure that the gasket is sitting flat and evenly pressured. If you have any kind of situation where it's not, that's where you get leaks from. Again, in an ideal world, you'd be able to go in there with a torque wrench. There just isn't really that much room in there, and you're not really gonna get an accurate swing with the torque wrench anyway. So this is where I really recommend having a short 1/4 inch drive ratchet and really just feel for it. We got the valve cover in. I'm gonna go ahead and actually lay the harness back on and reconnect the grounds, and then we'll move over to bank 2, which is the left side. So here on bank 1, which is the right side, your ground stud is gonna be directly behind the breather box here. And then you have this ground stud right here, which is also one of the mounting points for the ignition coil cover. Remember from earlier, so. And then the main ground on the valve cover is just that 13 millimeter nut, which is also that ball stud for the ignition coil cover. Doesn't have to be tight, just, you know, reasonable. Now we'll just click our injectors back on. So pre-installing the lock kind of gives you that nice audible click, and you can watch them drop into place. Just think it's extremely important on this injector harness, because it's not tied down to the valve cover. So if any of these was loose, you would find out very quick. So at least on this side, you'll be able to see the RTV placement. Just a little dollop will do you. That was a little bit more than a dollop, so we'll just use the excess dollop right there. So that, in my book, is way too much. So just wipe the excess. You know, all that is just to take up an imperfection between those two mating surfaces. Classic BMW right there, where the front timing cover is separate from the cylinder head. You're gonna have to do that. Now we're gonna take our NRW valve cover, we're gonna bring it in from low, and we need to get it in the breather past the fuel feed line, which fortunately is flexible and works with us to a degree. We're just doing the same thing that we did on the other side. We have to reroute our wiring harness and secure it back into the bosses that are on the valve cover. You know, again, NRW did mimic the design of the factory valve covers. It's replicas, so these are gonna latch onto the exact same places. All right, valve covers are installed. So before we put the Plenum back on and start butting everything up, I'm gonna replace these original factory rubber couplers with the silicone couplers from NRW Design. Made sense going in this deep to replace the next weak link, which would be these rubber couplers. So I'm just gonna pull these clamps off. We'll reuse these when we put the new couplers on. But for now, get them out of the way. So the factory couplers are held on with these Eddiker clamps, which we're gonna have to cut to remove. That's fine. This is the original coupler. And over time, depending on how often you've removed these, You'll get like deformation here where the hose clamp bites down. The sealing surface in here might get chewed up, and while this is a MAP sensor engine, so you could deal with a vacuum leak, you really don't want it because this will ingest dirt and other debris potentially. So these will wear out over time, and while you're doing any kind of service work that requires the plenum coming off, it makes sense to me to install these upgraded silicone couplers, which are going to handle exposure to heat a little bit better than the rubber will. And I mean, you can see in a couple areas here, they've worn down significantly. NRW mimicked the factory design with the stoppers, so you don't have to worry about any kind of problems later on when you're dealing with the plenum going back on. So when you go to put the new piece back on, you're going to make sure that these are clocked correctly. So you see this little notch, it'll go on like that, and then this will also line up with the backing for the other hose clamp where you get access for the fuel rail. And NRW provides you more traditional style worm drive clamps, which are perfectly fine for this. You don't need Etiker clamps. And my recommendation on these is going to be to clock them facing forward. That way they don't interfere with the throttle actuators. And the included clamps are 7mm drive, or you can use a flathead screwdriver, but. All right, now we're gonna go ahead and put our plenum back in. Need to make sure that this hose in the back connects to the plenum. Torque spec, by the way, for the intake plenum is 1 Newton meter. To the intake plenum couplers, you need a very specific torque wrench to do that. So at this point, we need to reinstall the ignition coils. I'm going to start at the back of the engine because that is by far the worst, and then we will work our way towards the front. So. So at this point, I did start the car briefly, no misfires. Really important to make sure those ignition coils are seated. And then once you have confirmed that they are seated by the car running and not misfiring, we are going to reinstall our ignition coil covers. So those go push in the grommets like so. And then you have a little holder there for that. And then after that, we can reposition our expansion tank. There's a little stud that has to sit in a grommet, and then once that's in place, we'll reinstall the two 10mm screws. All right, we'll drop the base of our air box in. So that's how you go about installing NRW Design valve covers on an E9X M3, 2008, 2013, E90, E92, E93, or any vehicle that happens to have this engine put into it, because we know that these are being swapped into different platforms now. So overall, the installation is pretty involved. It is a tight engine bay. A couple of the valve cover screws are very difficult to reach. The ignition coils can be kind of finicky to get into place and also remove. So take your time, work your way through it. It is totally doable with basic hand tools. You don't need any crazy equipment to get this done. And in the case of this kind of vehicle, we know a lot of people are hands-on with it, and as these cars continue to age, it's little things like this that are going to keep it relevant and keep it reliable. So we hope you learned a lot. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment box below. If you like this video, hit the like button. Of course, you want to hit subscribe, and as always, we'll see you for the next one. Thanks for watching.